While they spun wool with quick fingers and embroidered linens that caught every merchant's eye at the market, Martha struggled to thread a needle without pricking herself 3 times. Her bread came out heavy as river stones, and her butter never quite sat right. By the time she reached her 23rd year, her father had given up hope of finding her a husband. The other village girls her age had married years ago and now tended their own hearths, while Martha still slept in the corner of her family's cramped cottage, listening to her mother sigh in the darkness. It was a cold morning in early spring when her father returned from the mountain trail, with coins jingling in his pocket and a strange lightness in his step that made Martha's stomach turn. A man had come down from the high country, he said, a widower who lived alone in the mountains and needed someone to keep his house. He wasn't particular about skills or beauty. He just wanted someone. Anyone Martha's mother had clutched those coins like they were salvation itself, and within 2 days Martha found herself walking up a steep mountain path beside a silent stranger with shoulders as broad as an ox and a beard streaked with gray. Thomas was his name, though he barely spoke, and he walked ahead of her on the narrow trail, never looking back but slowing his pace when the climb grew too steep. She noticed that the way he paused at the difficult parts without making a show of waiting. By the time they reached his cabin, the sun had moved halfway across the sky and Martha's legs trembled with exhaustion. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by tall pines with a stream running clear and cold just beyond the tree line. It was larger than she expected, with real glass in one window and a chimney that stood straight and true. Thomas set down the bundle he'd been carrying and gestured toward the door. "This is your home now," he said. And those were the first words he'd spoken to her since they left the village. Inside the cabin was simple but clean. A large fireplace took up most of one wall, with iron hooks for cooking and a proper crane for hanging pots. There was a good wooden table and 2 chairs that didn't wobble, a rope bed in the corner with a mattress that looked freshly stuffed with pine needles, and a smaller bed behind a curtain that Thomas nodded toward before taking his own things to the main bed. "You'll sleep there," he said. "I built it last week." Martha stared at the separate sleeping space and felt something ease in her chest that she hadn't even known was tight. Over the following days, Thomas showed her around the property with the same quiet patience he'd shown on the trail. He kept chickens that provided eggs and had a good vegetable garden plot ready for planting. His root cellar was well stocked with potatoes and turnips and preserved goods that he must have bought or traded for, because they certainly hadn't come from any wife's kitchen. He showed her the stream where he drew water and the place where the forest opened up with a view of the valley below that took her breath away. He didn't ask her to cook or clean right away. Instead, he made simple meals for both of them and went about his work of chopping wood and tending to repairs around the property while she settled in on the 3rd evening as they sat eating a stew. He'd made Martha finally spoke. "My family sold me because I'm useless," she said, looking down at her bowl. "I can't cook proper or sew straight or do any of the things wife should do." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he set down his spoon and looked at her with eyes that were surprisingly gentle for such a rough-hewn face. "I didn't buy a servant," he said, "and I didn't buy a wife who owed me anything. I bought you freedom from people who couldn't see your worth. What you do with that freedom is up to you." Martha felt tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them away. Over the weeks that followed, a strange sort of partnership grew between them. Thomas taught her things with a patience no one had ever shown her before. When her bread came out hard, he didn't sigh or complain, but showed her how to knead the dough more gently and let it rise in a warm spot by the fire. When she burned the porridge, he simply scraped out the pot and suggested she try stirring it more often. He never raised his voice, and he never made her feel small. Slowly, Martha began to find her rhythm in the mountain cabin. She discovered she had a way with the chickens, and they laid better for her than they ever had for Thomas. She found that she could mend clothes well enough if she took her time and didn't let anyone watch her with judging eyes. She learned to identify the wild herbs that grew near the stream and began adding them to meals in ways that made Thomas pause and take second helpings. One morning she woke to find Thomas already up and working on something outside. When she went to investigate, she found he'd built a small workbench near the cabin and was planing. "Wood smooth, what are you making?" she asked. "Shelves for the cabin," he said. Thought you might like a place for your things, but I don't have things. Martha said. You will. Thomas replied and kept working. As spring turned to summer, Martha began to venture farther. From the cabin, she found berry patches and learned which mushrooms were safe to gather. She discovered a meadow full of wildflowers and brought some back to put in a jar on the table. Thomas said nothing, but she noticed he changed the water in the jar each day so they'd last longer. Sometimes in the evenings they would sit outside the cabin and watch the sun set over the mountains. Thomas would tell her about the years he'd spent up here and about the wife he'd lost to fever long ago. He spoke of her with fondness, but without the raw grief that Martha had expected. Sarah would have liked you. He said one evening, she always said the mountain needed more kindness. Martha thought about that word kindness. It seemed too simple for what Thomas had shown her. But maybe that was exactly what it was. Simple, steady kindness that asked nothing in return. As summer deepened, Martha realized she was happy. It was a quiet happiness without the drama or passion that the traveling bards sang about. But it was real and it was hers. She no longer flinched when she made mistakes. She no longer apologized for taking up space. When traders came up the mountain trail to buy Thomas's woodwork, they began to comment on how well kept everything looked, and Thomas would nod toward Martha and say she's the reason without embarrassment or hesitation. One evening, as they sat by the fire with the first chill of autumn in the air, Martha finally spoke the question that had been on her mind for months. Why did you really come down to the village, she asked. You seem to manage fine on your own. Thomas stared into the flames for a long time. I was lonely, he said finally. Not for someone to work for me. Just for someone to share the quiet with. Someone who might understand that sometimes the best life isn't the loudest one. Martha felt something warm spread through her chest in the village. She had been a burden, a mouth to feed that gave nothing back. But here in this mountain cabin, with this quiet man, she had become something else entirely. She had become someone who mattered. Not because of what she could do, but because of who she was when given the space to be herself. As the first snow began to fall, Thomas built the addition onto the cabin. A small room with its own fireplace where Martha could have privacy and space that was entirely hers. He didn't announce it or make a ceremony of it. He just built it steadily over the course of several weeks. And when it was done, he simply said, it was ready whenever she wanted to move her things. That night, Martha lay in her new room listening to the fire crackle and thinking about the strange path her life had taken. She thought about her family in the village, who had seen her as worthless. She thought about how close she'd come to spending her whole life believing them, and she thought about Thomas, who had seen something different. Not a skilled worker or a beautiful bride, but simply another person deserving of dignity and space to grow. The years that followed were not without their challenges. Winters in the mountains were harsh, and there were times when snow piled so high they couldn't leave the cabin for days. Thomas's joints began to ache with age, and Martha learned to make poultices from pine resin and herbs that eased his pain. They had disagreements sometimes about small things like any two people living together would, but they had also built something rare between them, a partnership based not on obligation or tradition, but on mutual respect and genuine care. Martha learned that she had skills after all. She became known among the few mountain families for her healing knowledge and her way with animals. Trading parties would sometimes make the trek to their cabin specifically to ask for her help with a sick child or an injured horse. Thomas's woodwork became even more sought after, and together they built a life that was comfortable if not wealthy. On Martha's 30th birthday, Thomas gave her a small wooden box he'd carved himself inside. Was a deed with both their names on it. The cabin and the land were as much hers as his. You're not here because I bought you, he said. You're here because this is your home, and you've made it mine too in ways I never expected. Martha held the deed and felt tears stream down her face. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition. Recognition that sometimes the family you're born into doesn't see you clearly, but that doesn't mean you're not worth seeing. Sometimes it just takes one person to look past the surface and see the truth underneath. One person to offer kindness without conditions. One person to build you a place where you can finally breathe and discover who you really are. That evening, they sat outside the cabin as they had done hundreds of times before. The mountains stretched out around them, eternal and unchanging. But everything had changed for Martha.